Welcome to the Future of Field Service podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Nicastro. Today, we're going to be talking about the increasing demand for business leaders to be digitally adept. We know we are living in a digital world, and what that demands of leadership has changed, is changing, and will continue to change. I'm very excited to have with me today to discuss this topic, Russell Masters, who's the Director of IT and Analytics at DHU, a provider to the UK National Health Service. Russell, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Lovely to have you. That was a mouthful. Russell has been so kind to join me today on what is a bank holiday for him. So that's very nice of you to give me some of your time. Appreciate it. Before we begin our conversation, Russell, tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, your background, your current role, and kind of how we got to be here today to talk about what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's fantastic to be here. I know it's a bank holiday, but it's loads of fun talking about this kind of stuff, and I love to take the time out to do it. So my career, really, I've been in kind of, I guess, industry for 20 years, and pretty much all of that has been in services, either physical or digital somehow, hence my interest in this and, my passion for this subject area. The vast majority of my career was in fact in aviation. And so I've been fortunate enough to work in a couple of airline organizations, and the majority of that time also working at Rolls-Royce, where I was responsible for a whole range of kind of business transformation and digital services. And that's brought me, after quite a long time in aviation, to a big career change. And so now I'm in healthcare, and I work for DHU, which is a community interest company. And we support the UK National Health Service in providing urgent and emergency care services, a big part of which is the digital content required to make those services work. And whilst on the face of it, it would seem that, kind of moving from planes to people is a big shift, actually, there's a whole load of stuff that's very similar, notwithstanding the huge amount of digital content and digital technology required to make all of those services work.
Interesting. So, yeah, I've been covering this space for a little bit less than 20 years, but a similar amount of time. And it's interesting to witness and experience how digital has evolved, and what that means as it relates to the topic that we're talking about today. So, you through your experiences in industry, in services, and in different spaces, right? Aviation, healthcare. The reality is, no matter what industry we're talking about, the digital imperative is real, and it's an area where all organizations have been forced to not only adapt and embrace, but to really transform and innovate. And what that takes at the leadership level is really, really interesting. I think that we've asked our workforce to really do a 180 in how business is done and what value propositions we're providing from 20 years ago. And it's not an easy feat. And the way that companies lead is critically important in, the success or failure of those initiatives. So I'm curious, Russell, in your 20 years of experience, so I know a big chunk of that was at Rolls-Royce, and Rolls-Royce is obviously seen, as a leader in that industry with a lot of these things. How have you witnessed digital leadership evolve?
I think, obviously I've seen this all the way through my career, and I've been really fortunate in that I've been both part of delivery of physical services and digital services. And if you like, I've had kind of the dream set of experiences, because I've been able to do some of the doing, do some of the building of new things, and also lead some of the kind of more modern, cutting edge digital technology projects and services that you could ever want. And I think I consider myself kind of really lucky in that, I was born with a personal computer, probably the first generation to have a PC appear in their life. And yet, for me, it's still really, really challenging and really difficult as you take forward the blending of IT technology with the real world and go through what is effectively been the transition from IT and big IT and the way that that technology appeared in our life to the more ubiquitous version of that, which is digital. And every aspect of our life now is touched by some form of digital technology. And, I would suggest that, probably the generation of business leaders that we have now are right at the forefront of being the first to take those big digital tools and technologies and deploy them into their companies, into their businesses and their teams at any real scale and real anger. And so much of that is exciting, but so much of it is very scary. And I think what it's prompting is a wholesale change in the way that we lead and the way that we support our teams, the way we approach projects and challenges. If I think back to maybe 10 or 15 years ago when we were firmly in the kind of IT age, IT was by definition very technology heavy. It was kind of quite expensive. It was quite time consuming and quite a lot of effort to deploy these technologies into companies, despite the huge value that they delivered. We fly forward, 15, 20 years, and those technologies are becoming cheaper. They're becoming easier to deploy, and they're becoming so great to democratize. There's so much more democratization of those technologies into our daily lives. And it makes the challenge of taking those and making something useful out of them, both in one way, much, much easier, because the cost of doing so and the speed at which you can do so is much less, but also much, much riskier because you can get yourself into a whole load of hot water by deploying digital tools and technologies into your organization on scale and en masse. And I think I'm probably part of one of the first sort of generations of leaders who've really had to get their head round how do you take these digital tools and technologies and how do you deploy them successfully into your organization. And it's a really complicated story, and it's to do with people, and it's to do with technology, and it's to do with culture, and it's to do with philosophy. And I think what I've seen, the predominant trend over the last 20 years, as you say, has been just this complete democratization of those technologies and the availability of those technologies, and leaders wrestling with how do they make something really successful out of something that they probably haven't had a lot of chance to understand, but know is incredibly important and being used by everyone everywhere to make their businesses better, more effective.
Yeah. It's funny. I was smiling because the article that we published today actually is called, the headline is actually technology is the easy part, right? And it's, one of the things that I mentioned in that article is what you just said, which is, the democratization of these tools in some ways makes things easier, right? The barrier to entry is lower, the affordability is greater, the accessibility and availability, all of those things. But on the flip side, when I was writing about these things, we'll say 15 years ago, just embracing technology was a competitive advantage. And that is no longer the case. And so from that perspective, it is more complex because relating it to the topic we're discussing today, the understanding has to be far deeper, right? You could get away with at one point, the understanding being, okay, we need to go digital, right? And that was a feat, but it was a journey that was pretty easy to conceptualize and outline and embark on. And what comes next in the further iterations and generations of that strategy is more complex, and it requires a lot more expertise and understanding and all of those things. So I think that's a very good point. And like you said, both exciting in some ways and scary, right? For leaders to know that they have some work to do. I recently quoted an Accenture report that said all companies are now technology companies. So what are your thoughts on that statement, and how does that sort of underpin the importance of leaders becoming more digitally competent?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think there aren't any companies now you know, from the smallest kind of mom and pop shop retailer to the largest multinational that doesn't use technology in some way as part of either their employee experience or their customer experience and the product and the service that they provide. And so, yeah, pretty much every company is a technology company today. And building upon the point you were kind of making in response to the beginning of the conversation, I think historically, you know, in times gone past, it was about how do you fit the people to the technology? You know, the kind of technology would show up and it would do something. You needed to fit the people to the technology to make that work. Increasingly, it's now about how do you take the technology and fit it to the people? Because pretty much every successful company, every organization that exists today that's got any kind of future and is any kind of purpose has, you know, people at the center of it, whether it's the employees who deliver the end experience to the customer, or whether it's the customer themselves, or whether it's a whole network of stakeholders and providers and vendors and other people. It's always people at the core. And so I think that the big challenge for leaders today is how do you take something that is inherently very sophisticated, very technology based, and how do you make that really super simple and really super compatible with people so that you can get the best of both. And I think pretty much anyone who's been in sort of my position leading digital products or in and around technology will say that it's the people part that's the really hard part, and it's the part that can make a project really successful or an endeavor really successful or not. And I think, you know, as we're talking about what the leaders need to do to be successful in this area and how does digital leadership show up in a big organization, it is increasingly helping to enable people but with a background of technology and technological change. And I think that is one of the most difficult subjects for any leader to start getting their head around, and frankly not one that, you know, you're prepared for when you've come through maybe a university system 20 years ago or you know, have entered the world of work at that time. So that's the challenge for all of us, is how do we get good at making the technology fit the people?
What would you say are the biggest barriers to this happening? So if leaders need to become more digitally adept, what are the challenges in that happening?
Well, I think, you know, there's all sorts of things we could talk about, but there's probably a couple that spring to mind. I think first and foremost, like any big change in business, you know, or in society, there's a level of kind of understanding and knowledge required to kind of get started. And I think, you know, the subject of digital and IT technology and digital technology starts first and foremost with some pretty super sophisticated content. And that can be really daunting when you're starting to contemplate how do you take digital tools and technologies forward. There's always a sense and a you know, a concern that really maybe you have to actually be a developer yourself to be able to be effective in these areas. Maybe actually you have to understand, you know, architecture, or maybe you have to understand the latest technologies in order to be successful. And I think that is a very real, but not necessarily, it's a boundary, it's a barrier that can get in the way of a lot of leaders when they're starting to take these projects forward. I was actually having a discussion with a colleague of mine who was moving into a government role in and around technology, and she was really concerned, you know, what do I need to know about the cloud? What do I need to know about the latest coding language? And I think her situation is mirrored across many, many organizations. And the truth is, actually, you do need to know something about the technology, and you do need to find a way of interacting with the, you know, the many, many, many professional people that you'll meet, you know, professional developers, enterprise architects, and digital experts. But it's less about understanding what they're doing from a technical perspective, and it's more about having a common language set and some empathy and understanding, so that you can both work collaboratively as a team to take forward whatever you're working on. And so I think the first challenge for serious leaders who want to be more digitally enabled is to understand the subject matter a bit more, but not to be too worried about knowing it to the nth degree. And that can be as simple as, you know, networking, building up contacts and relationships with people in and around these areas. It can be taking the time to get to know your supporting developer team, IT team, understanding their problems, understanding how the technology works, and as well, self-educating yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's like the first sort of barrier, if you like, the first action to take if you're going to get serious about becoming a leader in a digital age, is to inform yourself. But I think then the really value added bit in all of this is, there are, hundreds, thousands, millions of really well qualified, very professional technology experts out in the world. And, it's probably the case that if you're as a senior leader involved in any of these projects, you're not there because you know the technology. You're there to build a team or to work with a team to take them forward and deliver some sort of outcome and some sort of end result. And I think one of the hardest things as a leader of a technological, kind of business, is to get yourself away from the how are we going to do it, more to the what are we going to do and why are we going to do it, and to start getting away from maybe some of the older, safer methods for managing projects and managing organizations, where it's about being prescriptive about what happens and when and why, and move into a more collaborative culture where we start to talk about, well, what is the outcome? What's the thing that we're going to achieve? And that's something that I've noticed has been really important in all the work that I've done in both in my previous roles and my current roles, is, how is this going to show up in the face of the customer? And that could have been in the face of the, the end user of the service, or in my case now, in the end patient. So the second big challenge for, I think, digital leaders is to start to get better at working towards outcomes and enabling your team to understand those outcomes. And then thirdly, really supporting them, moving away from a culture where you're the one making all the decisions and you're the one kind of driving all the actions, to the one where you're more making the team accountable for the outcome that you all need to deliver, and fostering a culture where we all work together to achieve an end result. And those are very different. Those are very different cultural approaches. Those are very different kind of management philosophies and ways of working, and not ones that are necessarily well understood or well practiced everywhere. And so certainly that's been one of the big challenges of the experiences that I've been through, both in previous roles and certainly in my current role, is how do you help organizations move away from action to outcome? And how do you build the right team and create the right culture and collaborative spirit where you can run at those things together?
Okay. All right. Those are good bits of insight into some of the challenges. So let's then talk next about some of the what not to do, right? So I think a couple things I want to touch on that I'm taking out of what you just said. I think, number one in my mind is that leaders can't completely offload the responsibility to become more digitally competent or adept, right? So this, there's a certain degree here of, okay, well, if I'm not an expert here, then I'll just hire someone to do it, right? So you let's talk about the idea of not, trying to cop out of growing your own perspective and knowledge and understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think you've got to decide, I think, when you are going to participate, or when you're going to be responsible for a new digital product or a service or some sort of transformation journey, you sort of have to make a conscious decision about how are you going to show up and how are you going to participate in that project. And I guess there's various ways that you can do it. Sometimes it's just about not treading on the toes of the experts, if you know what I mean. And so first and foremost, your first focus should be building a great team. And having built that great team, you've got to trust that team can do the task that you put them together for. Now, by the same account, you still have to be there and show up every day and show interest and kind of drive the energy. As a leader, your job really in a number of ways is to just pour constant amounts of energy into those projects. And so there is a tension there between wanting to participate, wanting to roll your sleeves up and get involved, but also getting in the way. And I think I've seen, and I've been myself part, and any experience I've gained here has been through, a combination of sort of dumb luck and mistakes and sort of slips and trips. It is really difficult when you're leading a big project to understand how far do you go in demonstrating that you're committed and care about it, and you're willing to take action and participate, and how do you make sure you don't go too far and stifle the creativity and the enthusiasm and the ownership of the team around you. And so that's a difficult path to tread, and one that you need to take a lot of care, but you certainly can't just kind of throw it over the fence.
Right.
I think the other thing that you've got to do is just always remain focused on what is the outcome. And I think a big learning point for me has been, historically, as a project manager of projects or in more junior roles, I always felt it was necessary to kind of drive for the most ambitious goal possible, because that felt like really good work. And it's taken me many years, really, and probably the most number of mistakes, and it's probably the area where I continue to challenge myself, to actually manage these things in a more agile method, and not in a kind of, to use the kind of fashionable version of the word agile, where it's kind of just constantly changing. What I really mean is to be properly agile, where focusing on what's the smallest thing that we can do today. What can we deliver in a week? What can we do really quickly and be really efficient with? And again, that is a big challenge for leaders, coming into these projects, who might be used to delivering in a more conventional way, with more sort of milestone driven culture. So both of those things really are the big challenge of what not to do. By all means, participate, but don't over participate. And you absolutely have to have control, but only in the way that helps the team take it forward in the most agile sense.
Yeah. So there's a lot of areas here that are a delicate balance, right? So that being said, I think just a couple key points to reiterate for folks. Number one is, as a leader, you can't, to your point, just throw it over the fence. This can't be a facet of your scope of responsibility that you just say, well, you know what? I mean, this isn't my area of expertise, so I won't worry about it. There has to be a greater desire to learn and grow and expand, in the sense of that understanding, not necessarily in the sense, to your earlier point, of becoming an expert yourself, right? Number two is this idea of, if you know that this is an area that you need to increase your knowledge of, but you are not going to be the expert, then you do need to hire a team of experts that you can trust. And then you need to allow them the culture and environment in which to do what they do and carry out the mission that you're setting forth. And to your point, that is often going to look different than maybe projects have in the past. So understanding that there needs to be some, morphing of workflows and culture and expectations to, be more outcome-based versus action-based. So all kind of areas of finding the right balance for yourself, your company, your team, your project that you're working on. But I think those are some really good points in terms of what not to do.
I mean, I think you've just got to show up. You've almost got to be there when the problems are there, and show up when the problems are there. So, trust that your team will take this thing forward, but recognize that, they'll get stuck at times. How can you support them and, kind of take responsibility for the problems, and then just kind of fade away when it's all working. But all the while, demonstrating that you really care and that you're bothered. And I've certainly tried to only ever associate myself with projects that I'm really passionate about and I care about. And I think that, again, is, another side to this kind of more modern leadership style that's needed to be. It's a much more feeling, much more empathetic approach to what are, effectively very technological and kind of, scientific problems.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, and that point traverses this topic into other areas of conversation related, though, to innovation, which is, as our businesses continue to evolve and transform in ways that are new and different, you mentioned earlier the idea of a more collaborative working environment. The more we all have to own our areas of expertise, but also work well with people that have different strengths, right? I mean, that's how this all continues to advance. You know, we had a conversation on here not too long ago about the fact that, you know, when you look at the topic of digital transformation, it's this very fragmented and siloed approach that is really killing businesses' opportunity to get a return on their investment, right? And so this idea of, you know, whether it's digital transformation or digital products and services, this idea of greater collaboration, better teamwork, you know, more agility is super, super important. So let's talk a little bit more about what that means, though. So I want to talk about 3 areas of what we should focus on doing. And number 1 is creating a digitally native culture. So talk a little bit about what that means, and you know, not that you can give anyone a blueprint for doing it, but maybe some thoughts on what it means and how to consider, you know, advancing that culture within a business.
Well, I think you've got to, you know, come back to my previous point about people and this being so people centric. I think it wouldn't be unbelievable in a lot of, you know, companies who, you know, people who work for companies who might be listening to here that, you know, digital projects, IT related projects, they don't always have the best reputation. They can be expensive, they can take time, they can be impersonal. And I sort of think the key to having a digital culture, if you like, is both to completely dispel the fear of these kind of activities and make them as accessible as possible. And that requires you to talk about them frequently, express them simply, make the language as simple and practical and real as possible. And there can be some resistance to that because, you know, it can sometimes be the case that kind of you have your experts and you have people who are very invested in maybe the previous ways of working. And so suddenly talking about it in maybe less technologically accurate terms or in a simpler way can be, you know, sort of counter to the current culture. But it's essential that you make everybody feel like they can have some part of these initiatives, and that digital capability and digital content can mean something to them. And then I think you've really got to start where either the customer or your workforce or both tell you, and you've got to make whatever you're working on as relevant to the problems and the challenges you've got at any particular time as possible. You know, and the more that you can talk about outcome, the more that you can talk less about the technology and what you're going to implement and more about the change it will make within everybody's daily lives, then the more belief that you can have. And that could be hard, especially if you're leading an organization where maybe there's a bit of legacy, there's a bit of history, or maybe you're sort of a bit earlier in your journey. But showing up every day, being really positive about it, is massively important. And you'll suddenly find, you know, almost you reach a critical mass where this stuff starts to move. And then before you know it, the whole organization is behind this and kind of seeing what's in it for them. And that's when this stuff's both at its most fun and it's best, because then you can capitalize on that energy and use that to drive forward whatever the right strategy is for your organization and move more towards a kind of digital first culture.
I was just thinking, you know, we talked earlier about how technology itself has become democratized, right? And it's almost this idea of now next we need to democratize the interest and responsibility throughout the organization, right? So the technology is there, the capability is there. It's the people part of it, the culture part of it, and weaving it into everyone's, you know, scope of work and everyone's language and, you know, all of that. Makes
and
sense.
making and investigating everybody who's involved in that change, you know, because whether you're moving from, you know, working on a certain application or maybe providing a service in a certain way, or maybe just gaining information or using information to gain an outcome, it's just so important that everybody, from the most senior person to the most junior and everyone in between, is involved in that, because otherwise you run the risk of it becoming a particular person, a particular area, or a particular department's kind of job. You know, much the same as historically, you know, the other productivity tools that we, you know, each organization came to know and love became ubiquitous. It's the same here. It's just got to be consistently delivered everybody engaged and made relevant for as many people as possible.
Okay. All right. There's a lot of other questions I could ask you there. And I think, we could certainly have you back and talk a bit about the how to, right, in some more granular detail with some of these things. But for the sake of today's conversation, area number 2 in terms of becoming more digitally adept is improving digital acumen. So let's talk about how leaders need to be able to talk the talk when it comes to digital.
Yeah, and I think this is another area where there's the potential to get caught out or trip yourself up. And I think first and foremost, you have to just be realistic with yourself. I mean, I've over the course of a 20-year career have found myself involved in increasingly digital technologies, increasingly digital projects, and over the course of that time, I've made it made a point, and I've made it a specific ambition to learn more about these technologies, learn more about the approaches, and learn more about the best ways to take these forward. It's about learning enough of the language so that you can converse, and learning enough of it so that you can engage with the team that you build around you and the team that you work with to take this forward. So you do need to know enough about the technology to make yourself educated and informed, but you don't have to be the expert. And I think learning to ask intelligent questions and learning to pick out the areas where maybe it's worth digging into a bit deeper or checking your understanding is probably a far more valuable skill than for example, taking yourself back to night school and learning all about cloud architecture and everything else. Primarily because you just won't do it justice. The standard in industry now is so high. The level of education is so high, and the quality of individuals that you can attract to these teams is very high. And so if you find yourself, and you should, involved in these increasingly digital projects, your job should be to become familiar and conversant in the kind of broad language and be able to know who to speak to about which challenge, which issue, and to learn how to bring those people together in a way that drives towards a common goal. And I would definitely advise against, trying to become, a very deep domain expert, unless you want to kind of retrain or something else. But at an executive level, I think it's about, how do I understand enough of this to actually bring together the parts to make something whole? Much the same as if you're building a house, you wouldn't lecture your architect on, where to put the beams and, how deep the footings would be. You'd trust that they know how to do the job, but you'd certainly have an opinion on what the outcome looked like, how many bedrooms and what it would look like, for example.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think, one of the key things here is pride, right? And don't let pride get in the way of, making impacts that matter here, right? So this isn't about pretending you know more than you do, or you know everything. You don't need to know everything. You need to know enough to be able to, understand where the business needs to go, and understand, what the end goals are, and to be able to, like you said, pour energy into the team and motivate them. But I think, the world we live in today, there's no way for leaders to be a master of all, right? And no need for, right? I think that the more you can, like you said, ask good questions and own the areas where you don't know what's being discussed, or, and because if you can just, if you can own that, and you can let your team, the experts that you've hired to execute here, let them educate you, because that lets them see that they're valued, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with, just admitting that, I know this much, you know this much. So what do you think? And what do you think we need to do next? And, like you said, trust the people that you have put in place to do these things, and just know enough to talk with them about what's happening and where it's going. I think that, there's this element for leaders of just, the whole pride and power, area that we really need to set aside, and just focus more on the people and team building, and the outcomes.
Yeah, and I mean, this isn't a digital challenge. I mean,
Right.
as much as we're seeing a technological, step change within industry, we're also seeing a step change in the philosophies that managers and leaders are using to motivate people to bring teams forward. And we hear a lot about, what's the purpose and the vision. And maybe historically those could have been treated as quite perfunctory kind of things that we just do because that's what appears in the corporate report or something else. But increasingly those are really important areas. And I think the other thing is, to your point on pride, I don't think it's necessarily about there's nothing wrong with pride. I think that's a good thing, but maybe accepting or tuning into the fact that actually creating the compelling vision for a team of super enabled, super capable people is actually something to be very proud of, and is actually tremendously valuable within an organization. Bringing together all of the right disciplines, lining them up in the right way, especially as most organizations today and most teams are multidisciplinary. We no longer exist in organizations where individual departments do their thing, because that we know that real truly game-changing outcomes come from combining lots of different elements together in a certain way. And so I think it's not just a digital challenge, it's a sort of modern leadership challenge. Is how do we create organizations with purpose and mission and vision, and how do we get super positive and proud of that, as opposed to maybe knowing what the right answer is at any point in time. And ultimately far more satisfying, I think, than always being the person who makes the decision and directs traffic.
For sure. Okay. And then the third area, what is your best advice for building confidence, competence, and capability?
Well, I think it's just building upon the conversation that we've had before. I think being, very, very curious about everything, every project that you're going into, certainly something I've had to watch for myself is to jump too quickly to a conclusion or an answer, and to try and encourage myself to be more open-minded. And the more open-minded you can be, the more flexible, the more adaptable you can be, and the more opportunities you can see. And the more opportunities you explore, the more you learn. I definitely think this is an area where, learning by doing is a really important part of this. There's, like any kind of new subject area or new discipline, there's so much information out there, you can almost paralyze yourself by trying to know enough to get started. And so I think you've got to start. But I think very much building upon your points, it's about taking forward whatever you're working on with, the confidence that you have the right team around you, and the humility to engage those team members, no matter how kind of small or big the question, and then use that and relying upon your kind of leadership belief and your skills and experience to bring all those elements together. And things will go wrong, and I've had many things go wrong in my career. But if you are, attacking things with positivity, if you're always doing it for the right thing, then my experience, you always get the support of your team and your organization. And the best thing to do is to embrace that and use that as one big learning experience. And I think that's, confidence comes from knowing it won't actually be that bad, if things go wrong, and embracing the fact that if you are working in small steps, your last mistake probably wasn't a big one.
Right. And I think when you talk about maybe not digitally native culture, but just the type of culture we need to be fostering today, period, right? This idea of a fail-safe environment is very important. Companies aren't getting ahead by playing it safe and, embracing the status quo, right? And part of being able to promote creativity and innovation and, is people not being terrified to make a mistake or to fail, right? And so I think that's a good point. Building confidence comes from making some of those missteps and recovering from them, and what you learn in doing that. And that's okay. And that's important.
And I think it's the learning the lesson is the most important thing. I mean, I would be disappointed myself if I repeat the same mistake again and again. And I think that's a really reasonable expectation, in the teams that you create and the organization that you work within is, well, let's make this mistake. And if we make it once, well, let's not make it again. And I think that's the most the most important, and seeing how you can build upon that, is in itself incredibly enabling. And I think maybe, just learning to trust your team and trust people is maybe actually one of the things that will have come out of the current circumstances. Obviously, we've all moved to remote working, a huge number of organizations that would have previously maybe been concerned about that, or maybe worried about letting people work from home, have actually seen it's worked really well. And it's a really good proof point of, it's not so much about worrying about the mistake, it's maybe trusting that your teams and you will actually make less of them than you might think, and will actually achieve more, and leveraging the power of people. As with all these things, whether it's management or digital, it's all about the people.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So Russell, last question, what is your best advice for leaders that know that they need to become more digitally adept, in terms of, we've talked about some of the, here's what not to do, here's what to do. What about specific, actions, or, whether that's resources or just, hey, maybe try this, what type of tactical advice do you have for folks?
Yeah. I mean, I can't confess that I knew all this when I, started, and in some of the roles. This is definitely the result, not the starting point, in terms of my experience. But I think a good discipline to get into, whether it's a digital project or something else, is focusing on the outcome. And that can sound really easy, but it's actually quite difficult to train yourself to think, what is the outcome I want to achieve? And it's not, I want these tasks done by this date. It's, well, I want my customer to now see these things, or I want my employees to now be able to do this. So that is a really good discipline. I think start would be the other piece of advice. You will learn far more by doing and getting involved than by not and waiting. And it's like any big life event, you're never quite ready. And so again, I would just say start. And network. Network within your team, network without your team, and have the humility as you do that to be really open about your experience, and not worry too much that maybe this is your first foray into this kind of world. Or maybe don't forget that as much as you've done 10 or 20 projects, you've still got a tremendous amount to learn. So just have that continuous kind of asking questions, networking, learning mindset. And with those three things, you won't go wrong. And I'm sure you'll have some slips and trips, but that is by far and away, I think, the best way to start.
Cool. Awesome. Well, Russell, thank you so much for joining us and sharing this advice. I think there's some areas here we could definitely dig into. So I'd love to have you back and have some more conversations, but appreciate you coming today on a holiday and sharing with us and our listeners. So thank you.
Oh, so it's been fantastic to be with you, and thank you so much for asking me. And it's been a great experience. Thank you.
We'll do it again soon. You can learn more by visiting us at futureoffieldservice.com. You can also find us on LinkedIn as well as Twitter at The Future of FS. The Future of Field Service podcast is published in partnership with IFS. You can learn more at ifs.com. As always, thank you for listening.